Hello and welcome to Abandoned Projects. Let's continue my reading of the Abandoned Superman story. And we'll just continue. So, I'm Joe. When Non spoke up, it was indeed his friend discovered, as bad as what it had been made out to be. Months ago, I shared an earlier draft of some of your research findings with several other scientists, as you know, to raise awareness of the issue currently facing Krypton. But it was during one of these conversations that the ruling council scolded me for spreading superstitious doomsaying without proper proof. They had just ruled in favor of handing control of everything to Brainiac, and so I went to the only person who could counter them, in the hopes that he'd believe us and could persuade them to listen. Seeing the direction of where he was headed, just as the taller man took a deep breath, Jor-El let slip an alarmed comment without realizing he had done so. "No, you didn't." "I did. I showed Zod your research. I attempted and succeeded in convincing him of the rectitude of your findings," Non stated miserably before he once again folded his face into a large palm that could have enveloped Kal-El's head single-handedly. "Zod believed me. The trouble was, he suggested that we not go to the council. He claimed he wished to hear from you, and that he needed time to prepare himself beforehand." Jor-El felt his head begin to spin with this news. He hadn't wanted to believe that Non could be involved in whatever scheme Zod had planned, but to find out that he was, from the man's own mouth, was horrifying. And try as he might to rein in his own temper, to keep from judging Non, part of him couldn't help but want to shake him and scream at him. Of course Zod, the opportunist, would want to take advantage of what they had found. Non, though, wasn't finished speaking. "It has only grown worse, though. I thought that by going to him, or to any other councils with your research, would help. But ever since then, Zod has blackmailed me to support one scheme or another. But overall, he has something much bigger in mind than simple minor political reforms. I fear he intends to take over, to oust the ruling council, which is why, when I told him of you, he wished to meet you in order to test to see if you would make a better supporter than I think." It was a lot to take in, and in that moment, Jor-El was grateful for the fact that he was already seated in a comfortable seat, rather than standing, for he felt certain that had he been standing, his legs would have given out on him in that moment. Non had given into a foolhardy deal, and was now paying for it. He could tell that it was tearing Non up, but part of Jor-El couldn't help but shrink from the notion that Zod dreamed of establishing himself as a military dictator. Krypton was no stranger to military dictatorships. Why, 3 centuries ago it had been in the grips of one. A terrible one that had seen many Kryptonians perish in a civil war. None more noteworthy than the noble Nightwing, who fought a rebellion and died a martyr in order to topple the aforementioned fascist government. Since then, the notion of a military despot was a taboo amongst Kryptonians, and yet, in response to having been toppled from within centuries ago, had simply made the ruling council keener to maintain its power and influence, with many lessons having been learnt in that time, such as how to wield power and to always maintain a certain military presence in the capital, even as Brainiac monitored everyone and everything. The lessons from 3 centuries ago had hardened the ruling council into the very monsters they had come to hate, so that in some ways there was no real change, only a change in figureheads and in state heads. And although Jor-El preferred them to a military despot, especially one as lusty for conquest and for war as Zod, the ruling council, while foolish, they at least didn't care to indulge in expansion or in the wholesale enslavement or genocidal annihilation of enemies who had been defeated, or of their families. Everything suddenly clicked into place for him mentally, as he pieced together Zod's angle, what he had been after, and why he had taken such an interest in Jor-El, and even why he had dropped Non's name. "But we spoke in his lounge, so why didn't Brainiac catch and report us?" Jor-El wondered as he tried to figure out whether or not there were limits to the AI, or what its angle was. He could not figure it out, at least not then. As he struggled and struggled to understand it, he realized just how far out of his depth he was in the realm of politics. People he could read, but these elaborate schemes were too much, and those who were determined to use his knowledge and thesis were unlikely to act swiftly enough to save Krypton's sons and daughters. It isn't going to happen. I won't be his puppet, Jor-El stated firmly as he eyed his scientific peer for a moment before he asked him, "Isn't there something we can do to take Zod down and make the council listen?" "Jor, it is impossible. You have either to dance to the tune played by Zod and his ilk, that of Brainiac, or that of the ruling council. None of them will see reason, and it isn't as though we could call for help or something," Non retorted with a snort of derision as he sagged a little in defeat. He did not realize it immediately, but his words gave his peer hope, as well as an idea as he gaped at him before he smiled in utter triumph. "Non, you're a genius! There is a way to sweep away all of their intentions, all of their attempts to claim our research and muzzle our efforts." "What? Did you hit your head when I wasn't observing?" Non wondered skeptically of him, with a doubtful look on his face. "The Green Lantern Corps could surely help us," Jor-El answered with a start as he stared his friend down with an odd look in his eyes. "How would we even enter into contact with them?" was the rejoinder as the taller man continued to look extremely doubtful of this plan, as evidently the inbred isolationist ideals of Krypton having had their influence over Non. While Jor-El could not deny a certain instinctive knee-jerk reaction against the notion of outsiders and of asking for help, he knew that Krypton was so far gone, so beyond the pall in need of assistance, that to not request assistance could damn all those on Krypton, and perhaps, by extension, those on Argos. Excited at the prospect of the all but all-powerful Green Lantern's Corps' help, Jor-El almost forgot himself as he paced up and down the small room of the chamber. "We could contact Sarai, who is on Zudar, with her husband Van Ul. Sorry, my brain's not working right now. Who will in turn contact the Corps. Two questions. How and from where? To contact outsiders is illegal, with the Green Lantern Corps at the very top of the list of people whom we are not supposed to contact," Non retorted exasperately as he threw his arms in the air. "Jor, we cannot do this, for if we do, the ruling council will never forgive us." "Bah! We have no need for their forgiveness if we all turn up dead," Jor-El snapped, impatiently and unimpressed by the doubt and hesitancy of his best friend, who seemed still reticent. "Non, what we must do is secure our survival, not cater to the needs of a group of corrupt bureaucrats. If we keep this hidden until the last minute, all should be well." "Well, I will make no contact with them," Non stated firmly, aware now that he could not talk down his compatriot. "No worries there, because I will with Lara," Jor-El replied as he began thinking rapidly. "We'll make contact with the Green Lantern Corps. Can you keep Zod from doing something stupid?" "I'll try," was the sincere promise. "On one condition." Jor-El paused, wondering what sort of condition his friend had in mind, if it meant securing his support, if keeping calm throughout Krypton. He hoped it wouldn't be something he'd regret later, especially given how Non had let them all down in recent months. "Which is that you tell me if you could forgive and let go of this mistake of mine. To tell Zod, that is," Non answered with a sudden burst of vulnerability in his eyes when he met his fellow Kryptonian's gaze. Jor-El stopped mid-pace to stare at Non in surprise. In all honesty, he had almost forgotten that detail, as well as the fact that the taller male valued his friendship so highly. He hesitated, as Zod had been the last person he would have wanted to share his thesis and data with. That being said, could he really hold anything against Non for very long? "I don't think I could hold anything over you for very long. I'm not best pleased, but Non, just as you need my friendship, I think I need yours more," Jor-El said sincerely, speaking slowly as he searched his own heart. He knew truth was needed, as they were about to embark upon even shakier actions than before in terms of legality and risks. What with how they were already hiding from Brainiac, they would soon be defying the ruling council, along with Zod, by seeking to work around them all, on top of breaking the law by contacting a Green Lantern, even indirectly. The smile that broke out along Non's lips brightened his entire face as he leaped to his feet to pull Jor-El into another rib-cracking bear hug, one that startled Jor-El and resulted in a hiss of pain from him, as he felt certain he heard something crack along his spine or ribs. "Thank you, my friend." Yes, now can you... Oh, put me down, please," Jor-El pleaded as he hissed again from the startled pain. "Oh, sorry, Jor," Non said, embarrassed, as he put him back down, as the other man stretched a little to get every crink out of his bones. "I was just so happy." "I know how it goes." There was a moment of embarrassed silence between them, as the emotions of the past hour raced to catch up with them, and as neither of them were exactly certain as to how to respond or behave in regards to what had happened. Theirs was an old bond, yet it had always been an all but unspoken one, and to speak of it and test it was uncharacteristic of both. Not that either of them would have denied it, as they both depended upon it too much. With that said, the only time it was ever tested was when Zor-El had left, as Non had been best friends with both brothers, and had to choose between following one or staying with the other on Krypton. With that having been said, duty and obligation had won out over personal feelings, as it so often did on Krypton. With that being another topic that neither man really spoke of too often, with others let alone each other or their wives, as Zor-El's departure had left a wound in both of them. A wound they were both determined to heal and resolve. Hopefully, there would be a later to deal with it, and with gaining Zor-El's forgiveness in Jor-El's case. Or so he thought, as they left for civilization. "We're clear for landing," Jor-El stated as he informed Lara of the hangar's permission for landing. Seated in the co-pilot's chair on their ship borrowed from Non that had been lent to them so long as they returned it within a week after their return from Argos, Lara had been more than willing to leave Krypton for a short time, if it meant getting away from the constant feuding between her stubborn husband and her stubborn father and equally determined husband. Sorry, I misread it there. Which was why when she was told that it would be Argos they'd be leaving for on a vacation, she had broken out into an open smile, one which had filled Jor-El with warmth to see. He felt guilty, too often when she wasn't happy these days, as he felt partly responsible for her lack of joy, in particular since she had lost her best friend Sarai to his quest for knowledge. His relations with her father was fraught. She hadn't gotten the chance to see the bubbly Astra in Z, all of which was his fault in some capacity. Yeah, that paragraph was kind of miswritten and was going to be properly edited later, but at least I read it and all its unholy, ungodly terribleness. It will be a good chance for Kal-El to see my father's farmland estates there, she had told him, to which he had nodded his agreement to. This was how they had ended up inside the ship, with her piloting it expertly, with Jor-El relieved that she was enjoying it, even though part of his stomach clenched when she did certain stunts or felt as though it would shrivel up. He loved her to bits, but he hated piloting, and could only stomach it because she was the better pilot of the two, and knew that she would never let anything happen to them. How she was a better pilot was a combination of lessons her father had paid for when she was an adolescent, and from her learning from Van Ol, Sarai's husband, who was a professional pilot and merchant, though he preferred Sudar ships, claiming that they responded faster and better than Kryptonian ships, despite the fact that he wasn't permitted to fly them within Kryptonian space. Have you had enough yet, darling?" Lara asked mischievously, with a wink in his direction. "Yes, quite," he grunted, having to resist the urge to scowl a little. Their flight had only been an hour and 15 minutes long, and yet it felt longer. "Ah, did you hear that, Cal? Daddy doesn't like flying when he's like this. You look so much like Grandpa," she teased with a giggle to her son, who babbled and giggled right back, having apparently inherited his mother's free spirit and love for flight. "I do not look like or behave in any way similar to Laura Van," Elle grumbled good-naturedly, too pleased that she was content to really put too much bite into his words, despite his dislike for Lorvan and his sleazy tactics when trying to separate Jor-El from the man's daughter and Kal-El from the boy's father. That paragraph was just terribly written. Here, when trying to separate Jor-El from the man's daughter and his own son, he was determined to let the old political animal poison his. He was determined not to let the old political animal poison his time with his family. Argos was a peculiar planet as far as Kryptonians went. It wasn't as reclusive as Krypton, nor as open to the universe as the majority of Kandor was. The ruling class of Kandor was similar to that of Krypton, while the lower classes were keen to open up to foreigners. It was almost caught between two worlds, not quite open to outsiders, but not quite unaffected by them. Filled with a curiosity for even their neighbors over in Krypton, they were, however, confused and bewildered by any attempt to depend upon Brainiac for anything and everything. Though they knew of him, they were contemptuous of the softer lifestyle of the primary Kryptonian world. These were farmers and hardy folk, who, though they utilized the latest in Kryptonian technologies and techniques for farming, they were in no way keen to forget centuries of tough living. Thus, they welcomed the couple as though they were one of them, in many cases laughing and sneering at those on Krypton who depended on an AI for almost literally everything. On the other hand, many amongst them scorned the scientist and his wife, thinking them somehow beneath Argos, born Kryptonians. As far as Jor-El knew, the only one who had ever gained unconditional acceptance amongst these people, in some ways, was Non, whose name carried considerable weight and was one that all Kryptonians respected, regardless of their background. With that having been said, Argos' population was nowhere near that of Krypton's, with it barely having enough to fill up a third of Krypton City, something that always managed to amuse Jor-El and even pleased him. He imagined that were Krypton to survive, were his people to survive with these two planets intact, he would have liked to retire here one day. Retire to the fields of Argos and raise Kal-El to be a scientist, yes, but also a farmer, or at least the sort of man who cares for and loves the land itself. Not just the people who care for it and profit from it. It was also the sort of simple life he would have loved to have shared with Lara, and he knew that despite her city upbringing, she would have adored it and welcomed such a chance with relief. It was why she had always deplored of going with Sarai to visit Xudar, as it was said to be larger than Krypton City. Lara hated cities and reveled in countryside beauty and forests and wilderness, and would have likely enjoyed being in the agricultural caste, had her father ever permitted it in her childhood. As a grown woman, she had been chosen for other paths, and even chosen some of them, but she would always hold a certain affection for the world around her. They had reserved one of Lorvan's villas on the planet, with it being appreciated by him to the surprise of Jor-El for its privacy and how low tech it was. There was no connection to Brainiac, no means by which he could interfere in communications and the like, or so Jor-El assumed, with it having some conveniences, but nothing automated. Pleased by this development, the man's son-in-law gained considerable newfound appreciation for some aspects of his snobby, self-centered father-in-law, with Jor-El the first to check out the communications unit and to test it without unpacking a single bag, too hungry to do what he came there for. Sure, Jor, just dive into work without a word about this place, Lara murmured, sarcastically, rolling her eyes. Sorry, just desperate to speak to that Green Lantern. Jor-El apologized with a glance her way. Seated on a sofa in the middle of the living space, which was connected to the kitchen, there were robots for service, but nothing that was hooked up to a larger network, with each of them individually set up, as stated, low tech. As to the rest of the place, it was nicely, if simply colored, in a chestnut color for the walls, while the ground was carpeted with carpets depicting, oddly enough, Krypton's night sky. It was startling and a little bewildering, but it was as close as Lorvan would get to actual art and culture. Yet, when he commented on how awkward it was to find such a thing beneath your feet, Lara stiffened and informed him, "It was my mother who arranged for that." Jor-El felt a stab of guilt for his light, if mocking comment. Her mother had always been a sore spot, especially since the woman had died when she was 4, after an extended illness, with Laura treasuring every single one of her memories of her. "I'm sorry, Laura. It was uncalled for," he said at once with a glance towards one of the walls and the turbolift unit on the left-hand side, whilst balancing Kal-El on his left knee. "Why don't the robots settle us in while we grab a drink, refresh ourselves, and get comfortable?" "Fine. I suppose given all the comments Father makes about you, you're entitled to a few about him," she replied with a roll of her eyes again, with Jor-El gritting his teeth in response to this comment on her part. It was times such as these that he honestly wished Laura had a different father than the one she had. Whenever he heard about what Laura Van said or did behind his back, he felt an overwhelming sense of contempt for the man, combined with the urge to break something, as he annoyed him so badly. But such an instinct wasn't to be obeyed, as it would only show how easily the old man could get under his skin. Besides, they had more important things to see to, such as getting Kal-El comfortable and Lara eased into the summer estate, before he contacted Sarai and Old Van over on Sudar, with Jor-El forced to admit that he had underestimated how comfortable this place was, and how much even he needed time to relax since his last trip, and the losses he had endured on it, forced to admit it later that night after having almost forgotten about his responsibilities. He felt refreshed after a shower and dinner with Lara, the first they had had, which didn't involve political or scientific discourse. He was stunned by how much he had missed such a mundane event, with it clicking something into place for him emotionally. He wished in that moment that the dinner could have stretched on to the end of time. It was so peaceful. He was happy then, though he didn't know if it was fair to those he had lost to think and realize such. Yet it was Lara who reminded him of the importance of their mission, as they held hands across the table and laughed at the memory of one of Sarai's brother's antics. The man had been an eternal flirt, who couldn't cross the road without chasing one pair of legs or another, and yet he always managed to find a new woman and to cherish her, only to swear off women the next day. Then, when he'd set foot outside, it would be a repeat. And yet, he had been one of their most cherished friends and valued scientists. They remembered all the others, too, with Lara saying soberly, after a few minutes without any laughter, "Shouldn't we be contacting Sarai and Ulvan?" The memory of his duties and tasks came back to him in a rush, with Jor-El sobering up immediately. Not that he'd been drinking, and for the somberness of the past week to return to his face. "Right, let's do that." Doing so with a sigh while Lara moved Kal-El and Crypto, who had accompanied them, to the other room where the 2 newborns could sleep peacefully without being disturbed. She was back just in time to hear Jor-El explaining what he had discovered to Sarai and her husband, who kept her from interrupting half a dozen times, as he was far more impatient than she was. When he had finished, she remarked boisterously, "What a fine mess this research has led us into." "What are you going to do, Jor-El?" Old Van asked worriedly, the old hint of admiration and respect in his voice. Despite having wanted his wife far away from research into Krypton's core when it had become dangerous to do so, he had always held a certain admiration for Jor-El that he had found uncomfortable, unused as he was to being admired or respected so by someone other than Non. "I intend to have you patch a Green Lantern into this call, if you've managed to find out what his comm number is, that is," Jor-El said, stumbling a little as he stumbled over that information. It would be a problem if they couldn't find such information on such short notice. Now that he thought about it, it was likely impossible to find, especially given how the Green Lantern was likely a famous figure and unlikely to take well to his number being bandied about to anyone seeking help. "Sure, we've already tried contacting him," Sarai informed him with a shrug of her shoulders. "To be honest, his contact info is easy to find with just needing to call up the Green Lantern Corps' main office on Sudar. And they patched us into this real stick in the mud, Salak, and from there, he patched us to Tomaru. Tomaru is the Green Lantern of our space sector. We explained what it is that's happening in Krypton's core, and he said he'd get back to us in a few hours, after he was done with a slave trafficking ring," Ulvan added helpfully, with an amused look to his babbling, excited wife, who, realizing that it was she that was she was doing, and began to look a little embarrassed. This was far better news than what Jor-El was waiting for. Never in his wildest dreams did he think it would be so easy to contact a member of the esteemed Green Lantern Corps, They were as stars in the sky in comparison to mere mortals such as they, with Jor-El fairly certain that since Krypton had pulled itself away from the rest of the galaxy, that the Corps would treat it as a minor amusement or nuisance. They had no reason to take a plea from Krypton seriously at all. After all, with Jor-El feeling a burst of excitement at the fact that he had within his grasp the sort of help he needed at long last to save his people. With the Green Lantern Corps' support, it would prove itself almost a simple matter to save the people of Krypton. There were just two concerns they would have, though Jor-El did not realize it. The idea of transporting a large number of Kryptonians to the rather overpopulated Earth was bad in their eyes, especially with how violent humans could be. And what was more was how violent and conquering / how deeply the traditional Kryptonian superiority complex ran. It would prove even more disastrous for poor humanity. With that said, the other concern was how to transport them, with this being the main concern that they would have. With Tomaru not having the authority to effect such a transfer, without at least checking in with either Abin Sur or Appa Aliapsa, or another of the Guardians on the Council of Oa. Alright. In that case, I think I should start with my current plan to get everyone off of Krypton. It starts with, he was interrupted by the sudden beep of another person trying to join the call, only for the figure of a Sudarian to appear. He had the fish-like traits of the people of Sudar and kind eyes. This was the first thing that Jor-El noticed, with yellow pupils and dark eyes, along with the yellowish skin of the people of Sudar. This one appeared fairly old, though, as his skin had wrinkles, in particular around his eyes, with a smiling mouth on him that could have put anyone at ease, if such was his objective. The next thing that the Kryptonian noticed was the fact that the person next to the Sudarian, in the black and green uniform of the Green Lantern Corps, was decidedly not of Sudar. This man was tall and muscular. Overall, he would have been just shy of Jor-El's own height, yet with his deep red skin, bald head, and yellow pupil and dark eyes, he would have drawn every gaze in the room. So majestic and imperial did he appear. This man was doubtlessly of much greater rank than the Sudarian Lantern of Sector 2813, and was evidently of a calm disposition as he held his hands behind his back in a rigid stance. His legs apart held him up and were as muscular as the rest of him, although his gaze missed nothing, with Jor-El sitting a tad straighter in response to the sight of this lantern. Startled, he didn't know what to do, and briefly lost track of his own train of thought, as he stumbled momentarily, as he hadn't counted on two lanterns being available for the call, with the first of the two to speak up being the Sudarian, in what was a soothing voice so typical of the generous people of Sudar. Please, excuse our lateness. We were both preoccupied elsewhere. Now, how may the Green Lantern Corps be of service? My name is Tomaru, and I am the Green Lantern of Sector 2813, as you well know, and therefore required to be at your service. This is the Chief Lantern of the Honor Guard of the Corps, known as Abin Sur, who is also the Green Lantern of Sector 2813. Tomaru introduced perfunctorily, with a smoothness and politeness that immediately calmed Jor-El's nerves, as swiftly as it did everyone else on the call. We have decided that an emergency call from Krypton merits some concern, given how it has been centuries since you have decided to plead for Green Lantern assistance. Abin Sur spoke up at last. His own voice was deeper, and sounded as though it came from deep within the earth. Yet, there was also a kindly aspect to it as also. Alright, I'm pretty much ready to leave there, as we're now 41 pages into the story. As you can see, there's the hanging subplot of the Green Lantern Corps, which it's always bothered me that writers never went back to, they never mentioned why the Green Lantern Corps did not interfere in the destruction of Krypton. When originally in the 80s, the writers actually had an explanation. Tomaru tried to interfere, tried to help Jor-El, and failed with the, planet being destroyed anyways. So I decided to include that subplot, but expand on it, and have the conversation between Jor-El and the Green Lantern Corps on screen, so to speak. But anyways, if you like this video, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment.